"You're an embarrassment to this family," my mother said, her voice dropping to that particular register she reserved for moments when she wanted the words to leave a mark. "Owen runs 3 dealerships. He has a name in this city. And you show up to his engagement party, driving a city maintenance truck with mud on your boots." She didn't look at me when she said it. She was adjusting the centerpiece on the dining room table, moving a white orchid 2 centimeters to the left, like that was the most important thing happening in the room. My husband stood behind me in the doorway. I felt him go still, not the stillness of someone who doesn't know what to say, the stillness of a man who has learned, over 12 years of marriage, exactly when silence does more work than words. "We're not staying," I said. My mother finally turned around. "Of course you're staying. Your sister flew in from Vancouver. You will sit at that table, and you will smile, and you will not make this about your feelings for one evening." I looked past her to the living room. My sister Cassandra was already holding court on the sectional sofa, her fiancé's arm draped across her shoulders like a display item. 3 of my mother's friends sat across from them with the specific attention of women watching someone else's daughter achieve what they wished their own daughters had. Cassandra was laughing at something. Her teeth were very white. Her ring caught the light every time she moved her hand, and she moved her hand often. I had driven 40 minutes in a truck that needed a new muffler to get here. My husband had come straight from a water main repair on Carling Avenue. He'd changed his shirt in the truck, but his hand still had grease under the nails that wouldn't fully wash out, and my mother had already noticed. 3 hours after we left that house, my phone rang, not with an apology, not with a voice asking if we'd gotten home safe. What happened in those 3 hours changed every single thing. But before I tell you what the call was and who made it, I need you to understand what kind of man they were dismissing when they looked at my husband's hands and saw something to be ashamed of. His name is Patrick. He has worked for the City of Ottawa's Infrastructure Division for 14 years. He gets up at 4:30 in the morning when the temperature drops to -30 and pipes freeze under Canada subdivisions. He has crawled into water tunnels that most people don't know exist, in the dark, in the cold, to prevent entire neighborhoods from losing water pressure. He does not talk about this at dinner. He doesn't mention it to anyone. He comes home smelling like clay and metal and whatever the city is made of underneath, and he showers and he sits down and he asks how my day was. 2 years ago in February, he was working a night shift repair on a section of trunk main near the Rideau River. It was 11 at night, -26 with the wind. A section of temporary excavation shoring collapsed while 2 of his crew were below grade, 8 feet down in the trench. Patrick went in without waiting for the confined space team. He dug one man out with his hands. The second man had a broken pelvis. Patrick held him in position for 40 minutes in that frozen trench, talking to him, keeping him awake, keeping him from moving until the ambulance crew could get rigging down. The man with the broken pelvis, his name is Ray. He coaches minor hockey in Barrhaven now. He named his second son after Patrick. Patrick didn't find out until the birth announcement showed up on Facebook. He showed me the screen and didn't say a word, just put his face down on the counter and finished his coffee. My mother has referred to my husband as the ditch worker for the better part of a decade. I have never once heard her say his name in a context that didn't carry weight. That evening in her dining room, she pulled me aside while Patrick was getting his coat. She pressed her index finger against the edge of my collarbone and spoke in a low, fast voice the way she always did when she wanted to make sure the words landed without witnesses. "Your sister's fiancé has a net worth that would make your annual salary look like a rounding error. Owen's family has connections in this province that matter. I need you to understand that who you chose to be with is a reflection of your ceiling, and your ceiling is showing tonight." I looked at her hand on my collarbone until she removed it. "I'm going to get my coat," I said. In the truck, Patrick started the engine and let it warm up. The heat came on slowly, the way it always does in January in Ottawa. He didn't ask what she said. He already knew the category of thing it was. He pulled out of her driveway and drove 3 blocks before he spoke. "You want to get a coffee?" I did. We drove to the Tim Hortons on Merivale. It was almost 9 o'clock. The place was half full of people who looked like they'd also had long days. We got 2 mediums and sat in a corner booth, and I looked at his hands wrapped around the cup. The knuckles are permanently roughened from years of cold weather and physical work. There's a scar on his left palm from a pipe coupling that slipped during a January repair 5 years ago. The surgeon at the Queensway Carlton said he came within 4 millimeters of severing the tendon. He was back at work in 6 weeks. He didn't file for long-term disability even though he qualified. I turned the wooden ring on my right hand. My father made it for me the winter before he got sick. He was a Finnish carpenter. He built custom cabinetry out of a workshop behind our house in Smiths Falls, and he smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, and he taught me that you measure twice and cut once, and that the wood already knows what it wants to be, your job is just to listen to it. He died when I was 19. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end, he left me two things. The ring, turned from a scrap of black walnut he'd set aside for years because the grain was too good to use on someone else's kitchen, and the knowledge that a man who builds things with his hands is not a man with a ceiling. He is a man with a foundation. My mother remarried 3 years after he died. Her second husband has a financial planning practice in Nepean and drives a German car, and she considers this evidence of good judgment. She never said my father's name in my hearing after the funeral. She replaced his photos with a gallery wall of motivational phrases in serif fonts. In the booth at Tim's, I told Patrick what she'd said, the ceiling comment. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Does she know what the compression strength of a water main is?" I said I didn't think that was what she meant. He nodded. "No, I know." He drank his coffee, I drank mine. The restaurant played a country song I half recognized. We drove home on the 416 with the heater finally working properly, and I watched the dark fields on either side of the highway and made myself a promise in the cab of that truck that I have never broken since. Not one more tear for people who confuse your income with your worth. What my mother didn't know, what nobody at that engagement party knew, was what had happened 8 years earlier on a frozen lake 2 hours north of Sudbury. I was 28. I was working as a field medic contractor with a resource company running an emergency response team at a remote mineral exploration site. It was February. The ice road was still in but softening at the edges. A company helicopter carrying the regional director of operations and 2 geologists went down hard during a whiteout. The pilot managed an auto-rotation, but the tail section hit a pressure ridge on the lake surface and the helicopter slid 40 meters across the ice and broke through the edge of a refrozen crack. We got the call on the site radio. The response team was 22 minutes away by snowmobile. I was already in the field doing a routine check on one of the camp medic stations. I was 11 minutes closer. The protocol was clear. Wait for the team. The ice condition near pressure ridges was unpredictable. A single responder without backup and without surface rescue equipment was a liability, not an asset. I heard the transmission. I looked at the GPS reading on my phone. I started the snowmobile. I drove across open ice in a whiteout with 40 km/h wind, and I kept the tracks of the helicopter approach in my headlight until I found the debris field. The tail section was half in the water. The main cabin had stopped on a section of ice that was flexing but holding. I could hear it. A low, rhythmic creak under the weight, like the lake was deciding. 2 of the 3 occupants were conscious. The pilot was pinned by the instrument panel. The regional director, a man in his 60s, was in the co-pilot seat and had a head laceration that was bleeding fast. The third occupant, a geologist in her 30s, had already gotten herself out a side door and was standing on the ice behind me. I worked for 53 minutes in the dark and the cold to keep that man's blood pressure stable while I waited for the team. I used my own jacket to cover him. By the time the snowmobiles came across the ice and the evac sling went up, my core temperature had dropped enough that I spent 2 days in the clinic in Sudbury recovering. The regional director's name was Gerald Ashcombe. I learned later that he was not just the director of Northern Operations. He was a founding partner in one of the largest mineral rights holding companies in Northern Ontario, a company whose portfolio connected laterally to about 40% of the significant resource development projects north of the 50th parallel. He sent me a letter from his hospital room in Sudbury. On company letterhead, handwritten at the bottom, "Whatever you need, whenever you need it, you have my word." His personal cell number was written below his signature. I folded the letter and put it in the fireproof box where I keep my important documents. I never called the number. I went back to work. I had been carrying that letter for 8 years when my mother stood in her dining room and told me my husband was evidence of my ceiling. The morning after the engagement party, I drove to the diner on Richmond Road where I met my oldest friend, Nadia, every second Saturday. She was already in the corner booth with 2 coffees and the look on her face that meant she'd been waiting long enough to read my expression before I got through the door. "She said something," Nadia said. "She always says something worse than usual." I sat down. I told her about the ceiling comment, about the way my mother's finger had pressed against my collarbone like she was checking the structural integrity of something she'd built and found wanting. Nadia has known me since grade 8. She is a Crown attorney in Ottawa, and she has the particular quality of stillness that people develop when their job involves listening carefully to things that matter. She let me finish. "What did Patrick say?" He asked if she knew the compression strength of a water main. Nadia looked at her coffee for a moment. Then she said, "I love that man." I looked out the window at Westboro, January in Ottawa. The snow was the color of old concrete, and the sidewalk plows were running, and someone had written something in large letters in the fresh snow on the park across the street, but I couldn't read it from where I was sitting. "She's going to want us at the wedding," I said. "Front row, visible. Will you go?" I didn't answer right away. I watched the plow turn the corner. I thought about my father's workshop and the smell of sawdust in the cold air in November, and the way he used to hold a piece of wood up to the light to read the grain before he made a single cut. I would go if Patrick wanted to go, and Patrick would go if I wanted to, because that's how we worked. So the real question was what I wanted, and what I wanted was to stop being a prop in a performance I hadn't auditioned for. I'll figure it out, I said. 3 months later, my mother called on a Thursday evening. Cassandra's wedding was in 5 weeks. It was going to be at a private estate in the eastern townships across the Quebec border, 240 guests, a venue that had been used for 2 provincial political fundraisers and a Harper-era charity gala. Owen's family had a wedding coordinator on retainer. My mother had already bought her dress and her shoes and had strong opinions about where Patrick and I would be seated relative to the head table and how we would be introduced to the various people whose opinions she valued. She called to tell me that Owen's mother had expressed a concern. Owen's mother, her name was Evelyn, had made a remark to my mother over lunch that she hoped the wedding photos would reflect the caliber of the family Cassandra was marrying into. She had specifically said, and my mother repeated this with only a slight hesitation, that she hoped the guest list had been curated thoughtfully. My mother said, I told her that my family is completely appropriate. Appropriate, I said. I meant that we present ourselves well, that we understand the context. There was a pause. I knew what was coming. I had known since the engagement party. The arithmetic was already done. Patrick would be more comfortable, my mother said carefully, if he didn't have to spend an evening pretending to have things in common with people he doesn't know. Don't you think? I put the phone down on the kitchen counter without hanging up. I stood there for a moment with my hand flat on the laminate. Patrick was in the living room watching the Sens game. I could hear the commentary. I picked the phone back up. If Patrick doesn't come, I said, I don't come. You're being dramatic. This isn't about Patrick, then uninvite me. She said nothing. I said, call me when you've decided. I hung up. I walked into the living room and sat down next to Patrick. He glanced over. Sens are down 2, he said. I know. I watched the game. Neither of us talked about the phone call. We already knew the shape of it. The invitation arrived 4 days later, my name only. A handwritten note from my mother clipped to the envelope. Patrick will understand. This is about your sister's happiness. I hope you'll put family first. Patrick found it on the counter. He read the note. He set it down and went to pour himself a glass of water from the tap and stood at the sink for a moment before he turned back around. He said, go if you want to go. I said, I'm not going. He put the glass down. He crossed the kitchen and pulled me in and held on. His hands were warm on my back. He smelled like soap and cold air from being outside. I felt the tension leave my shoulders one layer at a time. I returned the invitation with a handwritten note of my own. 3 sentences. I am not attending without my husband. I hope Cassandra has a beautiful day. Please don't contact me again about this. My mother called 6 times in the next 4 days. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to none of the messages. The wedding was on a Saturday in May. I know this because Cassandra posted 47 photos before noon. The venue was as good as advertised. Owen looked like a man who had been told he looked good in suits, enough times that he'd started to believe his suits were his personality. Cassandra looked genuinely happy, and I was glad for that, whatever I thought about the rest of it. Patrick and I drove up to Gatineau Park that day. We ate sandwiches on a flat rock above a lookout. There was still a little snow in the shadows of the north-facing slopes. A raven landed 6 feet away and watched us eat with the specific interest of a bird that has learned that humans eventually drop things. Patrick threw it a piece of his sandwich. I leaned against his shoulder. The wind came off the escarpment. I thought about my father and the ring and the smell of his workshop and how I have never once stood in a place he made and felt like anything other than enough. 2 weeks after the wedding, I was at my desk at the clinic where I now work as a primary care paramedic doing paperwork at the end of a shift when my mobile rang with a number I didn't recognize. Northern Ontario area code 705. I almost didn't pick up. Is this Joanna? The voice was older, male, careful. Yes, this is Gerald Ashcombe. I don't know if you remember me. I remember exactly what I did in the next 2 seconds. I put my pen down. I looked at the wall in front of me where someone had taped up a transit map of Ottawa that nobody used. I breathed. I remember you, I said. He said he was sorry to call out of the blue. He said he'd had an event recently, a health event, nothing life-threatening, but the kind of thing that makes a man look at the list of things he's been meaning to do and start actually doing them. He said he had been thinking about me for 8 years. He said his company was expanding into an area that required a specialized emergency response coordinator for remote site operations, a newly created position, and he had asked his HR team to step aside because he wanted to make this call himself. He named a salary. I wrote it down to make sure I'd heard correctly. Then I looked at what I'd written and read it twice. He said, you can take as long as you need to think about it. I said, can I ask you something first? He said yes. How did you find me? He said, I've known where you were for 8 years. I was waiting until I had something worth calling about. There was a pause. I looked at the number I'd written on the notepad. I'll need to talk to my husband, I said. He said, of course, take your time. I sat at my desk for a long time after I hung up. The clinic was quiet. The transit map on the wall had a coffee stain on the corner I hadn't noticed before. I thought about the ice and the cold and the 53 minutes and the sound the lake made under my feet. I thought about the letter in my fireproof box. I thought about the ditch and the broken pelvis and the man who named his son after Patrick. I thought about the ceiling comment. I drove home in my own car, the Civic with the dent in the back quarter panel from when someone opened their door into me in the Costco parking lot. Patrick was in the kitchen making pasta. He had flour on his arm from the pasta dough, which he made from scratch on the weekends, and he looked up when I came in. I sat down at the kitchen table. Something happened, I said. He set the spoon down. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat. I told him about Gerald Ashcombe. I told him about the lake and the helicopter. I told him about the letter in the fireproof box that I'd never mentioned. I told him about the phone call and the salary and the job. Patrick is not a man who shows large emotions quickly. He has a stillness that comes from spending years in conditions where panic costs you options. He listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his spoon and stirred the sauce and said, without looking up, 8 years! 8 years! He set the spoon down again. He looked at the wall behind me the way he does when he's thinking through something structural. You want to take it, he said. I want to know what you think. He was quiet another moment. The sauce simmered. The kitchen smelled like garlic and tomato and the particular warmth of a house in the middle of the week in May. I think, he said slowly, that you saved that man's life in the dark on a frozen lake without anyone asking you to. And I think the idea that someone noticed that and held on to it for 8 years says something about who you are. He paused. And I think you should take the job. I looked at him. It's in Sudbury, I said. The office is in Sudbury. Some remote site travel. I know where Sudbury is. Patrick will figure it out. He said it the same way he says most things. No inflation, no performance, just the plain statement of a man who solves problems for a living and applies that approach uniformly. It's 4 hours. We'll figure it out. I called Gerald Ashcombe the next morning. I said yes. The news got back to my mother the way news always gets back to family members. You no longer tell things directly. Cassandra saw my LinkedIn update. My mother called my aunt. My aunt called me. My mother called 3 days later. I picked up. I don't know why. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I had reached the place where curiosity was all that remained. She asked about the job. She'd heard it was with a resource company. She asked about the salary. I didn't tell her the number, but I didn't deny that it was significant. Then she said, you see, this is what I always knew you were capable of. You just needed the right opportunity. I held the phone against my ear. I thought about the dining room and the orchid and the finger against my collarbone. I thought about the note clipped to the envelope. I thought about the Tim Hortons on Merivale and Patrick asking about compression strength with complete seriousness. What you always knew I was capable of, I said. You're smart. You always were. I just wanted more for you than Patrick. She didn't answer immediately. I wanted stability for you. A certain kind of life. He was in the trench in February at -26, holding a man with a broken pelvis for 40 minutes so he wouldn't move and make it worse. That's his hands I'm talking about. Those hands you looked at in your dining room. I stopped. I started again. You looked at his hands and you saw a ceiling. I looked at his hands and I understood what my father was trying to teach me the entire time. She said nothing. He gave me something better than a ceiling, I said. He gave me a foundation. I'm done explaining the difference. I hung up. My mother called twice more in the following week. I answered the second call. She asked me to talk to Gerald Ashcombe. She didn't quite say that directly. What she said was that she'd heard his family also had philanthropic interests, and that one of Owen's business contacts had a connection, and if I had an opportunity to mention, no, I said. Joanna, no. I said it once more, the same way, no change in register. I didn't pull him off that lake so you could use the relationship to refinance Owen's next venture. I'm blocking this number on Monday. If there's an emergency, Nadia knows how to reach me. I hung up. On Monday, I blocked the number. It is a particular kind of surgery, removing a person from your life who shares your blood. It doesn't get easier because you have good reasons. It doesn't hurt less because they earned it. You just do it the way you do any hard necessary thing. You make the decision, you carry out the steps, and you let the absence sit there until it becomes something you can live inside of. Patrick never told me to do it. He never once said a critical word about my mother to me in 12 years. Which is a form of love that takes more discipline than most people understand. He let me arrive at every decision myself. The night I blocked her number, we sat on the back deck in the dark with 2 glasses of wine. It was a warm evening for May in Ottawa, maybe 14 degrees. The neighbor's dog was barking at something in the hedgerow. Somewhere down the street, a kid was still outside on a bike. I said, I know it's the right thing, it still feels like something is missing. He said, yeah, just that. Not it'll be okay. Not you did the right thing. Just the acknowledgement that something being right doesn't mean it doesn't take something from you. I put my wine glass down and looked at the dark garden. My father's ring was on my right hand. The black walnut had gone warm from my skin. Patrick reached over and put his hand on mine. His palm covered the ring completely. I didn't say anything. He didn't either. The raven that follows you through the hard parts of your life, the inheritance that matters, it isn't money or access or a seat at a table curated for people someone else decided were worth the view. It's the knowledge of what it costs to hold on when everything is telling you to let go. My father taught me that in a workshop in Smith's Falls with a piece of walnut and a sheet of sandpaper. My husband taught me the same thing with his hands on a steering wheel in the cold every morning without once calling it a lesson. The strongest person in any room is not the one with the best connections or the most impressive last name or the right shoes at the right party. The strongest person in any room is the one who already knows what they're worth and stopped waiting for someone else to confirm it. I learned that on a frozen lake in February with my jacket on a bleeding stranger and my own hands going numb and the ice talking under my feet. I already knew what I was made of. It just took them dismissing me long enough for everyone else to find out.